if I can be mischievous, if I can feel mischievous, who knows if I am being mischievous,
Yes.
but if I can like feel a little mischievous or like feel like I'm getting after something, then that's a good feeling for me. And it's like one of the propelling forces in my studio practice.
Kat, I'm going to kick us off. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, let's do it.
One of the things, when I think about you, what I love about you is that it's so easy for you to find, well, you're so interested in all sorts of stuff around you, and it's really easy for you to get excited. And I always, and we all felt it. We all feel it from you. Like you get excited about things because you find the world interesting, and then people feed off of that. I'm curious. What you're in, like, what are you interested in right now? What are the things that are catching your eye? Like when, you know, I know that you're a new mom. Like how has that impacted sort of what you're interested in and how you're seeing the world right
now? Well, it's definitely, I think there's a sort of, I don't know if it's a perfect storm or whatever, but the world seems to be pushing me into like, or not pushing me, I guess, but I think there's some like focus on like the fundamentals, right? To use sports terms, because I'm now in like the world has gotten much smaller. I think both in revealing its systems and the way they're broken, especially the systems that like to be hidden. And so we're seeing some of those systems break down, but also just being at home with someone who is like really figuring things out in weird ways. And so I think that's, it's exciting to be here with him. And if I'm not too focused, it's the end of the semester. So of course I get distracted or I think about sort of getting through things. But in the moments where I am just with him, it's super fun because he's like, oh, this is this crazy thing that like I can open a drawer now. And so it's like these little breakthroughs that you're like, oh shit, yeah, things are really crazy. Like the fact that we can do all these things is pretty nutty, and we did at some point have to learn them, right? So that's been fun, and he's like a real good time guy, and so he's like a quick laugh. So I don't know that any of us are really funny, but he like really likes to laugh. So maybe we're getting big heads. But he's just like a very easy guy to be around, and so it's been fun to just have like a really sort of grounded home space, or our like home space now. Whereas like maybe it touched down on this before. The foundation is this real like sort of joy and learning and like giggling, which is kind of a fun place to be stuck for a little while. Because you know, if I can't distracted by all these other things, and that's where we land, that's a pretty good spot to land. So he's done a lot of kind of focusing us on the things that make us feel like nice, and it's just good to be alive like in that space, you know, where you're constantly reminded. Because I think that especially in studio practices and in teaching, it's really easy to get caught up in other people's expectations. And so that's one thing that he's done, is where it's like, oh, actually none of that stuff matters, right? And so maybe I'm throwing out all the parenting cliches that are like, oh, like the sort of, you know, like the bullshit of the rat race is being undone, right? But
How do you think it's, I'm curious, like, what are you interested in right now? What I mean, I know that's happening and that's a huge part of your life.
Yeah.
But am I right in saying that you've always been somebody that finds interest and creative energy all around you? Like that's always been easy for you.
Yeah, I don't know. Easy. Yes, sure. I think I get really excited by lots of things. And I think that people's like some of what you're saying, and like, it's very nice to hear. But I think I also am definitely activated by other people's energy and sort of curiosity and sort of the idea of improvisation and building and the sort of rules. And I never did improv because I was terrified of it in reality. But in theory, the idea of like, yes, and just saying like, yes, this is a thing. So like, let's go further. That's always been something that's pushed me. And some of the things that I guess, one, being around people has been a little tricky or not being around people has been a little tricky. But as far as things that I'm interested in right now, I just got through this big show that was maybe more serious, and in that it dealt with a lot of community issues of gentrification and like displacement. And so that was kind of a heavy thing that I had to take a lot of responsibility for. And so that has ended. and I'm kind of back in the space of fun sort of research where I'm looking out at these other things that are happening. So one thing, my friend sent me this card when he dropped off some sourdough bread, and this is, do you know Anne McLean? Do you know who this is?
Mm-mm.
This is the first woman, or this is the first person to commit a sort of non-territorial space crime, potentially.
Yeah.
And so like this happens in 2019. So to me, it's like the biggest story of the year. But anyway, so it has progressed since, and it became like, you know, less interesting in certain aspects. But the crime is super interesting because it's just a bunch of lesbian space drama. And so this woman checked her, as the story went, she checked her estranged partner's bank account from the International Space Station because they were going through this like divorce / separation, and there was a, you know, child involved and all this stuff. But it's this perfect, to me at least, that's like a perfect metaphor for all of us sort of like just being petty and like human, but it happens in space, so it's exceptional, right? And it's like, oh, actually utopia is like already a pre-failed proposition because we're still just human, and so we can't sort of run away from that. So even like one of the most exceptional humans sent into space is doing these amazing things, and then she's like alone, right? She just got lonely and petty and annoyed, whatever it was. And like, I mean, I did that in my college dorm room where I was like, oh, I have too much access to something that I shouldn't have access to anymore. Like, you know, and it's like a really kind of shameful moment. But anyway, it was broadcast. So I like the idea of this like metaphor of like pre-failed utopias and just like weird space drama. So that's something that I think I've been circling around and I put on hold for this other show I was working on. But I'm excited to get back into that. Lesbian space crime. So that's something I'm thinking about.
Well, you've always been a bit of a troublemaker.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of myself as that.
I mean, I feel like a lot of your art, kind of, you know, it kind of makes trouble. Like you do it with a charm and a sense of humor, but I
hope so.
Yeah, you do. But I think it's that charm and humor that allows you to make a little trouble with your art.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of trouble. Like, I think that there's something.
Am I right though? I feel like you kind of do that a little bit with your art.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, I think I house it in humor. Like I use humor when I'm talking about it, but I like to think of it as trouble. I like to, I don't know if it's push buttons or just like, if I can be mischievous, if I can feel mischievous, who knows if I am being mischievous,
yes.
But if I can like feel a little mischievous or like feel like I'm getting after something, then that's a good feeling for me. And it's like one of the propelling forces in my studio practice. Right. And like, I don't know where that drive comes from, but yeah, like being like, I don't know. I think I like to poke a little bit just to see where we can get.
I love that idea of troublemaking, and that I feel like there's something to that, you know, with your art and feeling that you're onto something, and it's that feeling you get when you know that you're right on the edge, like this could go either way. And I know, you know, when we worked closely together, I could always feel that energy from you, and I really liked it. You know, it got me excited because I think I'm a little bit the same way.
Yeah, I would feel like our practices were a little like-minded at times.
But I think so. Is that still like alive and well with your art making? Like, do you still kind of feed off of that kind of energy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely feed off of it, and like it's sort of how I channel it has become a little different. One of the things I'll say though about sort of troublemaking or mischief, it's really important for me to be thoughtful in that space because it would be easy for a punchline to cause mischief that is harmful. And so I think like I always want in some way, whether it's an audience or a collaborator or something, like I want them to be in on it with me, right? Like I'm mischievous within systems, and I think for whatever reason, the mischievousness comes from being what my friend would call like a careful reader. it's like when you're in a situation where like people are sort of going with the flow and you're like, wait a second, this flow is a little bit strange and maybe we should like call attention to that. That's a more interesting place for me to create mischief or to think about disrupting something, so that the audience can be in on it for the most part, right? If you feel indicted, then like you have another sort of relationship with the system to examine. But I think I want people to feel like they're welcomed into the joke. I would never want people to think like the joke is on them, right? Mm-hmm. So that's like a protocol thing that is important to me, at least when I'm making work that, well, I guess all work, right? That's an important protocol distinction.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I was thinking about as you were describing the things you're interested in right now, I'd love to know how you take some of those things you become fascinated with, and how do you get started? How do you take, lesbian space drama and then get into the studio and start to be inspired to make something? How does that process connect with you? What is it like when you get started?
Yeah, I mean, that project in particular is a little bit strange, because it came from, it was sort of a joke. I read this weird article in the New York Times that everyone seemed to overlook, and I was like, you guys, space crime, and it like happens to be dykey, I don't know. But there is, that one in particular was strange because, I was teaching this printmaking class and I was sick of just pulling random JPEGs off the internet, and it wasn't demonstrating practice to my students when I was doing demos. And so I made for a semester, and my students got pretty sick of it at the end, which was kind of great, because I don't like, there's things that butt up against each other in practice that can only happen like if you start kind of putting things together and moving them around. And so that project in particular, I was actually just using because I knew there was something there that I liked, and I was just using it to make demos, right? So I did like a photo litho plate and then screen printed on top of it. So I did like a picture. It's like the really kind of like Soviet space era photo, but it's like Anne McClain and another astronaut walking out of this like flat building. And so I took that and I did a photo litho, and then I screen printed the Bonnie Taylor line, "It ain't wise to need someone" over it. And so this is all part of a demo, right? Because that was necessity. But it worked to talk to my students about like, oh, neither one of these things is interesting, but it's like the butting up against something that's interesting. So that project, it doesn't know where, I don't know where it is. I don't think it knows where it is. I think it'll probably land in like a zine or something. So that's like a little bit different, but it was just a topic that I could show both research and process to my students, and like the continuation and the development of an idea. Other projects, I think for me, there is this like physical aspect that becomes important. So getting my hands on things, and making sure that like the form and the research are sort of going together. And for whatever reason, good or bad, right now it feels a little bit bad. My process is typically technically driven. So I do a lot of material testing. And I think that that like reveals a lot about the object or the image that needs to be made. And I don't know if I'm not someone who can sort of invent something in my head and like execute it. I need to see a lot of things and move myself and my brain and my body through things. And in that way, I think about play and improvisation a lot, where it's like, oh, there's something like really strange going on here. So let me do like 15 more silicone pores, and I don't know if it's floppy, that's great, and now how do we get it to not tear? And that's like part of the development. So I would say my practice is a lot of trial and error, and it creates a lot of offshoots, but it's sort of then, even if I'm working in the space of trial and error and failure and pushing systems like of making to weird places, then that's where the improv comes in, where I get to say like, actually I'm making a decision to follow this because I think it's more interesting. So it's sort of this like back and forth. But one of my mentors had a show a few years ago called "The Truth is in What is Made." And that phrase has really stuck with me, right? Like I can't sort of invent things and execute them in a way that is productive or even interesting. And so I think I just have to be like making things and drawing things, and that keeps me sort of honest and making decisions sort of outside of even what my brain could invent, if that makes sense.
Were you always like that, Kat? Like when you were in, art school, is that kind of how your process was, or has that evolved through the years?
I don't know. I think I probably was like that in some way. I was really into drawing when I was in undergrad at Augie. Scott Parsons had like a lot to do with that. And so I think, sure, you need to draw a line to make another line to edit it. So there was definitely that thinking, but I don't know that I had access to the contemporary art world or like materials that I do now. And I think I'm just like, this is something that I couldn't give you an answer for, but I really like problem solving, and I don't have a lot of fear when it comes to trying things. And maybe that's because I sort of believe in editing and letting a thing be its own thing and like have certain agencies. And so I don't need to control every little element, but I've never really been afraid to just try something. And that's been helpful. So it's probably evolved, and it's always probably been there a little bit, but it's definitely become like more and more prevalent in my practice. And also once you get into it, it like definitely perpetuates itself. You're like, oh, well, that's like if I keep making, making is a generative thing. Like if I make a thing, then it's going to spur me to make 5 more things. It's just my responsibility to sort of control that path, if that makes sense.
How often do you start making before you know what you're making?
I don't know. That's sort of like a parallel track. Like sometimes, here's an example with Kyle, right? So I've gotten really into this idea of legibility, and when things are legible sort of for the good and when they're sort of for the bad. And as far as like revealing things at certain times, so you can sort of seduce people into certain spaces before they understand that they're there, which is a pretty disarming way to enter a space. And so I was dealing with like legibility, and I was doing all this weird stuff with like silicone pores, which ended up being too expensive, and putting like different opacities of plexi on it, or even like those weird diamond light covers on it. So it would like really disrupt the image. And then that was like, I was doing that in December, and then 3 or 4 nights ago, Kyle texted and was like, oh, hey, I want to do this weird thing with like opacities and diffusion. And I was like, oh, check it out. I have all these material tests, right? So there was like this weird kismet that like, I don't know, sometimes the research sort of leads the way. So like this project I was working on dealing with gentrification and the displacement of a queer community, that was definitely research first. And then I used some of my other knowledges to support that research, so the form followed. And then other times I'll be making something, I'll be like, yo, I do not know what this is, but it like needs to be a bigger thing. And then I'll make like 100 of them and be like, oh, now I sort of understand it and can move on. So I think it definitely depends on sort of the push and pull of the project and where the project needs to go. Mm-hmm. But in that way, like, I feel like my material like I am sort of a collaborator in that way with my material in sort of the same way, and with conversation and like the energies like feeding off and feeding into other energies of people. Like material is sort of the same thing.
With something like silicon, I mean, do you start working with that for the same reason? You're just interested in this thing and you want to see how it works? Is that how you select that type of material?
No, silicone is like strange. I think everything is like, again, if your form is following your research, you're like, oh, well, maybe I need to like make this weird boat, you know? And then you like get really into woodworking, and then that like becomes a thing that you keep going back to. You know, like what's the old saying, like to a man with a hammer, the whole world's a nail, right? So that's how you solve problems. It's like through this one material that you've become semi-efficient with. And then my mentor in grad school had us do this weird silicone workshop. And then years later, so then during grad school, actually right after that, I was like doing these weird silicone tests and mushing them and smushing them and then casting them. And then it was a few years later where I like found an old cast, and I was like, oh, this material is like goopy and strange and hot pink, and like that I'm sort of into, right? So then it sort of circled back. So part of that is just being present, right? And like making sure that you're paying attention to the things around you as you're making them, right? So I was given this opportunity to do the workshop. That was great. And then sort of revisiting it years later as like all of my new sort of thinking and material research went into that, then it was like, oh, this actually has like a lot of potential. And even like one of my dear friends in grad school had been using silicone the whole time, and I sort of never saw that potential until years after grad school. And I was like, oh, there's something here. Also, though, it's very expensive. So it's limited, you know? Mm-hmm. But also with stuff like that, it's fun because people who make those, like, I think people consider some of my work to be sculptural. I think that's great. I don't know that I actually think like three-dimensionally or in the round. I think I always think pretty frontally and image-based. But I really like tactility and sort of how the body becomes a site for interpretation when touch and space is activated. But if you get into groups of people who are making things, and especially I feel like in sculptural fields, the sharing of knowledge there is amazing. Like people will tell you anything and everything to say like, oh, this is this weird thing that I found works in my studio when I'm using silicone. So a friend told me about mosquito netting and I was like, oh, brilliant. And then another person told me about magnets and I was like, oh, you guys, this is really good stuff. But people are really generous when it comes to like materiality and sharing these sort of technical skills that they've learned from other people. So that's also been, I think, a seductive part of working in kind of strange technical materials, is that people are very friendly and they want to troubleshoot and problem solve with you, and they try to share what they can, right?
How long do you typically spend in that space where you don't know what something is? Like where you feel like it's going to turn into something, but you're not sure. And how long do you have to wait before you figure it out? And what do you do to help it along?
It's pretty dependent. Like this lesbian space crimes business, so that's not a sort of technically weird space, but I think conceptually I haven't like figured out how to stick the landing yet. And so that's been sort of an ongoing thing that I haven't really actively pursued. And so maybe it'll come to the forefront now that I have this kind of weird in-between time where I won't have any classes this summer. So that one has been kind of stewing, but I know I like it, so I keep sort of bringing it back. And I also have this like SVU series of prints that I want to make about Olivia Benson, but that's okay. I watch a lot of trash TV. So, but like so there are all these things that I think conceptually I'm kind of circling. Other things, I mean, they seem to reveal themselves through the process pretty quickly. I did this weird, I don't consider myself someone who usually does performances, but I did this weird closet confessional for this dance party I was hosting. And that came together very quickly. I mean, that was like sort of a few weeks, like maybe a weekend of like careful sort of planning and scripting and research as far as like protocols that happen within the confessional. But, that piece was really quick and it just sort of revealed itself, and it had sort of a finish, where some of these other pieces where they become series or they become kind of bigger. Yeah, so it's very dependent. That's like a long way to say each project kind of does its own thing. And to stay in it, I think the important thing is to not let the thing go. And so like even my buddy Arthur, I talk to him about this all the time, and he and his wife were into it. And so like continuing to talk about it and like remembering like just like the good thing that sort of sparked your interest there, that's important, like to keep the joke going in some ways, because like that goodness has to stay fresh. Mm-hmm. Otherwise it goes away.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. Keep the joke going. Don't let it go. Just keep it alive. Yeah. There's so much to that. Just keep it alive. Keep the idea alive somehow.
Right. Totally. This is another thing. Now I'm thinking about all these projects that I've like been like keeping alive.
Yes. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. But, and like, this one is years in the making. It's so far beyond my ability right now. Like I have no idea what to do with it, but Bess and I saw, there's that Strauss opera play, Ariadne auf Naxos, and like nobody at this point, Bess is like, stop talking about this. Like I cannot. And so, but it's this play, and like, and I don't usually have access to that world in a way that I like feel excited, but Bess is, has introduced me to a lot of really wonderful things, and this is one of them. And we went, and to me, I left the theater thinking Strauss didn't stick the landing, right? Which is like not a thing that I ever thought I would say. But it's this like really amazing setup, and the play is great. And then the second half, which becomes more operatic, is like a snooze fest. And you're like, this is a perfect setup for a joke. And now we're like in this like weird space. And so I want to remake the opera as like a really strange drag show. Like that's something that I feel like, because I think the ending needs to be done. And maybe all these like, anyone into opera is going to be like, you're a dummy, totally stuck the landing. I'm going to be like, well, I don't think so. so, but anyway, so now I'm like talking to people because I'm not part of a drag community. I'm not sort of like in this operatic thing. So like now it's like, oh, I actually need to like really talk to some people if I'm going to pull this off. But I do have some like, I mean, where I can bring the heat is in like my 80s, 90s pop music situation. Like I got a lot of rock in my pocket, you know?
At what point do you give up on an idea? At what point do you say, okay, I guess that's it. I can't go any further. I tried.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. Like practices are lifelong, right? If I'm 75 doing a drag show because I still think Strauss is a dum-dum, then like that seems okay, right? But if the only time I would stop ideas if the thinking behind them becomes problematic. And so like, you know, there are things sometimes that you're like, oh, I'm into this. And then you're like, think about it for 10 more minutes. And you're like, oh, actually like, woof, that's like not, you know, like that's leaning into some of my like privileges or like unknown sort of implicit biases, whatever. That's when you like have to drop a thing, or if there's like potential harm to come out of it. Or if like the joke would be on the audience in a way that is not, you know, like some people are really good. I don't think art has to be nice. But I know that I operate from a place that like prioritizes some form of inclusion. And so I think for me, if it feels like the joke is on the audience or if there's any cruelty, then like, that's not a good joke for me, right? But anything else just has a longer shelf life, you know?
What else are you working on lately? What are some things that are cooking right now?
Cooking right now? Well, actually, so one of the unfortunate things about quarantine for someone who has like a technically driven studio practice is that I like can't go and just like dink around with things in the studio. And so I've been doing like my drawing practice has really come in to play again. And I think also, you know, it's like not who knows, it's not like an academic drawing style, but I've been doing like blind contours. I'm really interested in failure. And I think blind contours, where you sort of don't look at the paper and you just kind of follow the object, those create like a lot of weird fun surprises. Like you're done looking at them or you're done drawing and then you look at them and you're like, oh, that's like a really weird thing that I did, you know? And so that's in some ways refreshed some of the seeing or some of the thinking about just like seeing and honesty, that maybe some of my technical stuff, well, it's part of it, I don't need to sort of translate spaces directly. And so there's like a real kind of meditative, honest place that has let me exist. So I've been doing that. Also, like if you're chasing around a 10-month-old, that's like something you can set down, you know? So like here I have a sketchbook. If, or like that's a Sierra Mist can, right? Like, so you can like sit and just like do a thing, or like this is a Viking my mom brought back from Germany in like, I don't know, the 70s. And so like that's something where you get to like look at your environment and translate it and then also surprise yourself, which to me is like a perfect combo, you know? And you can set it down at any point and just be like, oh, I have to go and like change a diaper or like make sure this kid doesn't eat a rock, you know? And like that makes it like a valuable practice right now. Yeah, so that's like the thing that's kind of keeping through quarantine, like the thing that's keeping, I think, my practice in some way more present than it would be or than it could be otherwise. If that makes sense.
Are there anything on the horizon, like any shows that you're getting ready for or starting
no,
for?
actually I think after this, like I had a solo show in January that like for various reasons sort of took its toll. So I actually think right now is kind of a fun studio space to be in because it is like these things like the lesbian space crime or the Ariadne off Noxus. Like there is a certain amount of time that I just need playing that doesn't have any public pressures. I had like a few prints that I was going to put into like some juried shows. So, you know, maybe that'll still happen, but I'm not creating any new work for a thing, which is actually like a really freeing space to be in right now. Because then I get to sort of control it without the outside pressures. I would still, you know, consider myself pretty young in my career. And I'm learning a lot still about navigating these spaces and like how to collaborate with institutions and sort of read situations that still sort of honor or fight for the integrity of the work. And so having moments that don't have any of those pressures I think I'm learning that those are going to be important in my future. Because I think I'm also like a people pleaser, you know, so like I do have, the thing I'm learning is how to, like I think a lot about sort of core values of things. And so I know what the core values of the things that I'm doing are, or like who I am. And I think that it's hard when you're working with institutions to sort of keep those forefronted. And so these are things that I'm like learning as I'm interacting with people. Ipso does a great job. Like Ipso sent back work. I got some smalls. I got my like thing that has become, I didn't realize I was wearing it till like 5 minutes ago, but it's like always on my vest. But like, you know, one of the core values that I think happens at Ipso is like, you guys are super generous and you're super caring. And like, that is a really great foundation for just having like a good time, right? Because then people don't sort of need to put up other weird guards. And so like if generosity can be sort of central and care can be central, then like you can't really like stray too far, right? Because it'll self-correct.
You know, people might not realize, but the bear that hangs in Ipso,
the pink bear,
the pink bear, you made the pink bear.
I did. You know, that was one of those things that I had no business doing. I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
Like, but like, even if you look at that, you're like, I'm sure if a sculpture walks in there, they're like, that's like an extruded bear, you know? And I was like, when I made it, I was like, holy shit, I did a thing and this is great, right? And I like hung it from a ceiling.
Yeah.
But I think that like, I don't think I ever want to claim a space that it's not. Like it's this real silly thing that hangs in the air that I'm not excited about.
One of my favorite pieces, and I mentioned this earlier, but I love the ball glove that you made.
Ball glove.
I love it, you know, and I have it with me. It's one of the things that I keep near me when I'm working or when I'm thinking about work or ideas.
Yeah.
Or I like to have the ball glove. Yeah, I love the ball glove. Talk about the ball glove. That whole body of work, you know, that was for your Augie show.
Yeah, that was for the Augie show. I think in that, well, that show particularly had like a lot of the sort of mischief drive behind it. I was thinking a lot about identity and its development, but through the lens of these like arbitrary sort of spaces in which we hang our like this like strange importance on. And so for me, that's always been these like weird, like prove yourself physically or game stuff, you know, like in games become these microcosms for these bigger things. And like, honestly, the strangest part is that other people at the game are like, this is just a game. And you're like, no, I don't think so. You know, like, it like gets real strange. But so that piece, like, you know, baseball does a lot of things in the American psyche, but also like I grew up playing ball, and there's something about sort of the idea of a ball glove that is comforting to me in a strange way. I think that like, it probably is for a lot of people. There are a lot of weird stereotypes about being like queer around a baseball glove for a woman, or like some people would be afraid of, I don't know. But for me, it's sort of this like weird comfort item. And then the baseball glove that you have is a result of like really weird sort of technical processes that I also had no right doing. Like I was like, oh, I'm gonna figure out how to use this like weird embroidery machine and do leather with it, you know? And then like laser cut some felt and see what happens. And so like it was the result of a lot of strange experimentation to sort of create like, I mean, basically now that I'm thinking about it, like a blankie, right? Like this weird comfort item that's like nice to have around, but it's like a total failure. Like it doesn't work at all for what you need it to do, except it's doing exactly what you need it to do. So that was like, yeah, there's something really nice about that guy. But
well, and you know, we've talked about maybe having a frame made for it so we can put it up on a wall, but then I'm like, well, then I wouldn't be able to touch it and have it.
I know, that's the hard part.
Like,
I don't know what to do with frames. I'm going to make everyone, whoever has one of my pieces, just furious, because I'm going to be like, I'm going to stick a thumbtack in the wall.
Yeah, I have several Kat Burdine pieces around me, kind of at all times. You know, like I have a nipple. I have one of your nipples.
Yes! Did you get that at Zambros, or did I get you one of those?
I think you gave me one of them.
Yeah, I probably did. The nipple is like a really good one.
I have little trinkets of little Kat Burdine trinkets all around me.
That's also something I had no idea what I was doing. I was like, casting people's nipples. I guess that's like a grad school thing. I don't know. But then like pouring pewter. I like had a little like cook stove that I was like melting pewter in, and like, I don't know. I'm sure the metals department was like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh no, I'm in print. I'm just making a lot of them. That's what I know how to do.
Well, a few things you've said, I'm just kind of curious about. One just being, when you left Fresh Produce to go get your MFA, you went into an environment where you could wholly focus on creating. And now over time, you've gone into like teaching and having a family. And so there's a lot fighting for your time right now. I'd be curious, just as a working artist, how intentional do you have to be about giving yourself time and space to create, and how do you balance everything?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Yeah, grad school is such a weird place to make work, to be honest. And I had, like, there were so many other things going on during grad school that I even look at the work I think I made and started some good work during grad school. It was the foundation for a lot of thinking that I've been doing or was doing probably a few years out from grad school. But I had never sort of been in an environment like I was at grad school, and my dad was real sick. So there was like also this strange grief that I wasn't sort of acknowledging. So actually, I think out of grad school, I've had more productive periods. Of course, grad school was productive, but in very like sort of different ways. And then I've had these productive periods. And then I think, I'm 11 months into having a kid, and I don't even know that I have an answer to that. I think that I have learned how important it is. I'm a dummy, and so like I'm always like I can like listen to Netflix in the background and do a thing, right? And I like sometimes intentionally split my attentions, and that's not something I can do when I need to be in a conceptual space. And so since Lyle has been around, making time to be alone in that thinking and protecting that space has become more important. Because you gotta like vacuum and like do dishes and grade papers and pieces during nap times. And Bess is working, and so when I was working for the show, it was this really like grueling thing where Bess would get home and I'd go to the studio at like 9:00 at night and get home at like 4 a.m, which I like don't recommend at all, right? Like there are a lot of things I could have done to avoid that, and some things I couldn't have, right? But I think that becoming really productive or protective of that time, but also being able to cross the line faster. That doesn't make sense. I'll explain. But like crossing line faster is saying like, I think before there was this real fluidness between like, especially I would say like Fresh Produce or even some of the years post grad school, where there was this fluidness between like what my like day life was and what my studio life was. And that was, so it was easy to sort of switch back and forth and say like, oh, I'm just going to carry some of this energy into this other space. And now I think being more intentional about sort of how I'm carrying myself and how I'm thinking about space in all of my spaces. So being like more intentional about how I'm living my lifestyle, rather than saying like, oh, I'm going to like turn off and, like be a parent now and like not be someone who's thinking about all these other things. Like it would take me so long to reactivate when I got into the studio space that I'm sort of realizing more and more is like an impossibility. So I can't sort of turn off the same way. So it's actually, the bleeding has to happen, like the bleeding into spaces has to happen both ways. Like my studio has to come more into the house, and the sort of house has to bleed more into the studio. Otherwise I would spend like, the 4 hours or 30 minutes that I have to make something or to sort of think about something and be in my own headspace, I'd spend it like trying to get into a headspace. So I think that that's important. So protecting that time, but also like hitting that time running or something. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, there are periods of my life where that is easier and periods where it's harder. And, like I just have to figure out what that means. It's hard. I mean, it's hard.
You enjoy teaching?
Yeah, I love teaching. I don't know, like there's so much about it that's so good, and like it can be frustrating, but I really like the creative energy in a classroom. I really like, I was lucky Augie had like a good education program, and so some of my like dearest friends are teachers in like, elementary, junior high, high school levels, and have been generous enough to share like what it means to manage a classroom, right? Because if you get your master's in anything, they don't teach you how to teach. They teach you how to like be a professional in your field. And so I really like the sort of like organized chaos of a classroom. I like the idea of the sort of improvisation, or like kids saying things and then you're like, oh, I don't know, let's go there, right? So like if like someone comes in and they're, I don't know, making work about motorcycles, and I'm like, well, I better read up about motorcycles. Like I have no idea what this like is about, or like mystic crystals, right? Then I'm like, oh, actually, I do know something because I set up a power station at Fresh Produce. And they're like, oh, my teacher knows about power stations. And I'm like, just enough, you know? And so I think that at the university level, they keep me on their toes. But I also, like, I talk a lot about creative process. I think the best part about, who knows if it's the best part. Some other people who have like different pedagogical thinking might think that I'm like bullshitting it. But to me, establishing within all of my sort of curriculum or projects, the idea of creative process and talking about it, right? Because I think it's easy to take for granted the idea of making something, but it's really hard when you have to make multiple things at, you know, the same time, especially like, I don't know, in different creative fields when you're making all these different projects. And so really laying out like how we think about how we're making or how we think about what we're producing, or, you know, like where ideas come from, you know, or for me, even making sure that everything, that there are these learning elements within the classroom that aren't just demoing technical stuff, but also just like weird research stuff. So that's like, you know, like demonstrating lesbian space crime or having weird workshops to like investigate some weird topic just so that we can do it, or readings that deal with what it means to like be a motivated reader, right? If that's the language we're using. So I like articulating creative process because I think it's really detrimental when the creative process breaks down and you don't even know how to talk about it, right? And so being able to give tools to sort of talk about it and then, you know, like be adaptable in that space is important. So it's fun because then the classroom becomes this like sort of, I don't know, it's like a little laboratory, right? And we're all like mad scientists doing weird things and you just sort of have to like hang with it.
But with your students, you'll ask them where an idea is coming from, or you'll ask them about their creative process. And
yeah, totally. I mean, it depends. So like for my freshmen, it's a pretty regulated process since they haven't gone through a lot of like articulated creative processes where it's like, okay, come back next week. And Ted, you and I have talked about this, but like the idea of like 3 ideas, right? And like, don't phone in 2 of your 3 ideas because you like one of them, right? Like actually like go with the thing. And so they, you know, freshman year, typically I'm asking them to bring in 3 thought out ideas. And I'm teaching at the Cleveland Institute of Art, and the guy from one of the directors or producers from Coco came through because the school has a relationship with Pixar. He's from here, whatever. And in his whole like lecture, he's talking about how you have to have 3 ideas. And then all of a sudden my students come back and they're like, oh, Kat, they were talking about 3 ideas. And I was like, I know, I'm not a dumb. You know, like I actually like, this is a thing that like, you know, it's your first idea might be great, but it's probably not always the best, you know? And so the ability to sort of work past that. So yeah, I think it's much more sort of guided in their first year if they have me as a teacher. And I think a lot of my sort of coworkers right now are the same. And then by junior year, I'm really trying to get them into research and saying like, okay, you have this idea and you have this like love or passion or interest, right? And so how do we like lean into that, right? And it doesn't have to be like sort of book learned research. I guess learned sort of is a bigger umbrella than I'm using it, but like you don't have to just do sort of academic research, right? Like research can be going out and like throwing a ball around, or it can be going out and like, you know, for one of my students where like skateboarding is this thing, right? It is like, oh, actually like you're not from here, so go and like skate, you know, like skate here and see how you can make work about that. So I think really leaning into this idea that art is the byproduct of living and not sort of the other way, right? Like, or I guess they are, but like you have to sort of experience a thing and be invested in the thing and like love the thing to make another thing, right? You can't sort of invent the feelings that exist around something and it be credible. Mm-hmm. If that makes any sense. But I try to sort of push my upper level students into thinking about like the meaning making and the thing that they're doing around it. Mm-hmm. But
I love it. That's great.
They're good. Students are real pains in the ass, but they're also like really good.
Kat, it's so great to see you.
Yeah, it's fun.